Let me emphasize that the Hebrew key is of the utmost importance. For understanding the Greek of the first three Gospels, few commentaries give adequate attention to this point. In the 19th century, scholars often spoke of the Semiticisms in the Synoptic Gospels, but such discussion waned considerably in the first half of the 20th century. Even today, in the vast majority of Christian seminaries, a gap exists between Old and New Testament studies. Professors of Old Testament receive specialized training in Hebrew, while their New Testament colleagues receive specialized training in Koine Greek. When an Old Testament professor reads something in the Gospels that sounds Hebraic and should happen to comment on it to a New Testament professor, the latter may respond, "You stay in your field, and I'll stay in mine." Moreover, when Christian students begin a program in biblical studies in their first semester, they are often asked to declare concentration, of course, work in either Old or New Testament. It is most unfortunate that these areas of study are considered mutually exclusive. One can find in the academic literature on the Gospels the claim that the writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke imitated the Greek of the Septuagint. This is an attempt to explain the numerous Semiticisms in the Greek of the Synoptic Gospels. Scholars theorize that these Semiticisms are the result of the Gospel writers mimicking the writing style of the Hebrew to Greek translators of the Septuagint. I do not find this explanation convincing. If one encounters a Greek text that has been influenced to a large degree by Hebrew, one should entertain the idea that he or she is dealing with a text that has been translated. This is the most obvious and reasonable explanation. Nevertheless, a serious scholar must examine each Semitism of the text on its own merits and ask the question, is it possible that this Greek phrase, clause, or sentence could have been written in a way as to copy the language of the Septuagint? In a number of cases, this question cannot be answered in the affirmative because several Mishnaitic Hebrew or post-biblical idioms appear in the Synoptic Gospels. In other words, how could writers who are supposed to have been mimicking the language of the Septuagint have invented Hebrew idioms belonging to a stage of the Hebrew language that postdates biblical Hebrew by hundreds of years? Of course, one could still claim that the Gospel writers were Jews writing Greek as if they were speaking Hebrew. That claim is worth entertaining, and I do think that it is accurate in the case of the Pauline epistles and other books of the New Testament. But I do not accept it with regard to the Synoptic Gospels and the first half of Acts. For example, consider Luke, who wrote a Gospel in Acts. In the last half of Acts, Luke's prose contains few Hebraisms. In the first half of Acts, however, Luke penned prose with a noticeable Hebraic character. This suggests that Luke relied on an earlier source when writing the opening chapters of Acts, but abandoned or exhausted it by the time he started writing the later chapters. In his Gospel, Luke wrote a prologue, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, in such refined and polished Greek that it is reminiscent of the classical period. The prologue spans 4 verses and is immediately followed by 24 chapters of Greek that may be described as Hebraic or Septuagintal Greek. These chapters are filled with Hebraisms, lexical, syntactical, and grammatical. Clearly, Luke could write beautiful prose in Greek if he so desired. Faced with this evidence, I cannot but conclude that Luke 1:1-4 is a sample of Luke's personal literary style. He penned these verses and did not rely on sources. Beginning with verse 5, however, Luke relied on sources that were written in Greek, but which had been translated from Hebrew. The Hebraic character of these sources percolated through Luke's composition wherever he consulted them.